My name is Dr. Ernest Guile, Jr., and the date is July 14th, 2015. I am interested in recounting an event which occurred in the fall of 1960 in Florence. And this event was inspired by the emerging civil rights movement at that time. The events that actually influenced the thinking was the sit-in movement that began February 1st in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 students went down to the local Five and Dime to acquire food at a lunch counter. Well, on this particular day in the fall of 1960, I was a senior in high school, and this emerging movement that had begun throughout the South to integrate not only accommodations but food establishments and restaurants. That particular day, a friend of mine named Henry Thomas and I discussed the thought that, well, isn't it important also that we look at libraries, because this is a source of knowledge and information, and this is where our true freedom lies. So as a result of that discussion, spontaneously and on the spur of the moment, we decided to go to the Florence Public Library and attempt to get a card as well as check out books. So we walked down to South Irby Street, across town from where we were, in fact, at the time, and went up the steps to the library and went straight to the desk to the librarian. And we requested a library card. And the librarian told us politely that she would not be able to give us a library card without really giving an explanation of why. So we decided that we actually queried back and forth briefly with her as to why, but we didn't really get a good explanation. And I think the librarian, from the look on her face at the time, was kind of surprised that we were there. And so we decided to go into the stacks and look at some books that we were interested in. At that time, based on inspiration from my family and school, I was very interested in many topics. I was an avid reader. And at that time, my particular interest was science subjects. So we took some books from the stacks and went over to one of the tables and sat down and began reading those books in the library, hoping that at some point they might change their minds and give us the opportunity to check these books out. So they left us alone, and we continued sitting there and reading. And as I recall, the library was rather empty at the time. There wasn't a lot of people there. And so we approached closing time, which was about 6 o'clock. And the librarian came over to us and told us that the library was closing and that we would have to leave. So we said, well, we don't want to leave until you give us a library card and let us check out these books. So the librarian again told us that that wouldn't be possible. So we continued sitting there, and it went past closing. And obviously they wanted to go home, I would imagine. So a few minutes later, we heard sirens, and the police came. They walked into the library, and they were on both sides of the table that we were sitting at. And they told us, boys, the library is closed, you have to leave. And we said, well, we wanted to get a library card, but they wouldn't give it to us. They said, well, I'm not quite sure the exact dialogue at the time, but they continued to emphasize the fact that the library was closed. and that we had to leave. And they repeated themselves. And so we sat there quietly for a while to see what would happen. And at some point, the policeman said, if you don't leave now, we will arrest you and take you into custody. So I had a brief huddle with my friend Henry, and we thought about the implications of just deliberately getting arrested and taking it that route, or the alternative was to come back the next day and try again. So we concluded that, okay, today we're going to leave. and if we do the strategy of getting arrested, we might do that at another time. But we'll come back and see whether they make decisions that might allow us to get a card the following day. So we concluded after a brief discussion that we could deploy the strategy of getting arrested at another time, but today we're going to leave and give the library a time to make a decision about our getting a card. So we left and went home, and we had no further interaction with the police after leaving, and we decided to come back the next day. So we came back the next day, and we found a sign on the door saying, this library is closed for renovations. And we came back several days in succession, and we saw the same sign. So we made a conclusion that this is going to be closed for a while. So at some point, we stopped checking, and we waited a few weeks. So between November or early December 1960, and February 61, we decided to come back and check. So on February 22nd, George Washington's birthday, we came back and we found it open, to our surprise. And we walked into the library and went to the desk with the librarian and asked for a library card. And to our surprise and delight, the librarian handed us a form. We filled it out with all the information and our address and so forth, and they gave us a card. And we actually went and got books and checked them out that day. And we left the library really, smiling that our efforts have really paid off. And this could actually open the door for everybody else in the African American community in Florence to use the library. So we made it known to our friends and everyone what had happened. And so subsequently, that occurred and the library was integrated and without any fanfare. And I have to add to the story that our inspiration really came from, the great leaders that we had at the time. Dr. Martin Luther King was already well known, and he'd already had a successful bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And that event was a very important event in my personal life because it made me more, how should we say, conscious about the importance of literature and books and study. And so subsequently I went on and studied at several universities, including Morehouse College, University of Pennsylvania, University of California, Berkeley, and at Harvard. And so that was a part of that initial inspiration for me. And actually, I continued to participate in the civil rights struggle. I was actually at the March on Washington, and actually I have a photo that I'll bring to the library of me standing behind King when he gave his speech. So I'll send that to you.
That'd be cool.
And so the great leaders of that day were very inspirational to Henry Thomas and myself. And those include my father, who was the president of the NAACP in Florence at that time, and my uncle, who was the first African-American lawyer in Florence, who was a World War II veteran.
What was his name?
William Webster Bennett. And my father's name was Ernest Guile Sr. And also, because of my father's position as president of NAACP, he actually greeted a lot of national prominent civil rights leaders who came to Florence to give oratorical presentations. For example, Thurgood Marshall actually came to speak in Florence, and he stayed at our house. And I remember that. He was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund at the time, and at that time they were preparing for the Brown versus Board of Education case at the Supreme Court. And also Clarence Mitchell had stayed at our house, and there was a story about him being arrested at the train station in Florence. And Roy Wilkins also came. And you might say, well, why did these people stay at your house? The reason for that was there was no hotel that they could stay in coming to a southern town. So they had to, be accommodated in the homes of the host families. And that was a very typical, kind of circumstance at the time. And one of the other great leaders that I was inspired by, and actually ended up going to the college that he was president of, was Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays. And he was a South Carolinian, born in 96 South Carolina, a sharecropper family. His father didn't want him to get an education. He subsequently went to high school at South Carolina State. And there's a movie about him, a documentary about him on South Carolina Educational Television. And he left South Carolina State and acquired a bachelor's degree from Bates College in Maine. And he subsequently got a PhD from the University of Chicago. And he was president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, which was one of the early African-American historical black colleges, started in 1867 after the Civil War, and between 1940 and 1968. And he, in my view, and in many people's view, was one of the architects and grand masters, if you will, of the civil rights movement. And why did I say that? Because he was the key mentor for Dr. Martin Luther King. He actually mentored King not only on orations, which was a very long-standing tradition in the African-American community, but he also introduced King to the idea of nonviolence via Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy, because President Mays had actually visited India and had met Mahatma Gandhi. And so King was a student at Morehouse as an early entrance student. I think he entered at the age of about 14, thereabouts. And he graduated in 1948 from Morehouse College. And interestingly enough, when King was assassinated, Dr. Mays actually gave his eulogy at the funeral. And also at the March on Washington, Dr. Mays gave the benediction at that famous march in 1963, August 28, 1963. So the reason why I'm giving all this background is because I want to bring out the importance of Dr. Benjamin Mays, because he's been an inspiration for many in their lives, and he has been quietly known as really a key person for the development of the civil rights movement, which has, in many respects, made America a more perfect union. So I wanted to close on the story about the library integration success in Florence, South Carolina, by at least illuminating these historical figures who were the inspiration of the generation of the civil rights protests. Thank you very much.